Egalitarianism has a longer tradition in the US than in the UK, evident in different attitudes to social class. Notions of class barriers and status are different in Britain and the US, since class hierarchy has historically not been recognized in American society. This was evident in the constitutional frameworks resulting from the American Revolution, where traditional political manifestations of class hierarchy and the principle of inherited roles were rejected, and egalitarian concepts such as an elected head of state and a legislature without seats allocated to the upper class were established instead. Britain, on the other hand, still has constitutional and political positions for members of its upper class, such as the monarchy and the House of Lords. Furthermore, instead of class barriers and status, the American dream, with everyone supposedly able to reach the top, has historically been prominent in American society. Britain, on the other hand, remains the least socially mobile Western country and still very class conscious. Nonetheless, inequality and significant differences between socioeconomic groups have become more the norm in the US, and there is less class division in Britain today compared to the past, perhaps making these two societies more similar today. Recently, these historical notions and traditions have been challenged, in other words, and this unit, coupled with Gary Love's lecture available on our course website, will explore class in American and British society, looking both at history and contemporary views on the subject. On the night the Titanic sank on her maiden voyage across the Atlantic in 1912, social class proved to be a key determinant of who survived and who perished. Among those who lost their lives were 40% of the first-class passengers, 58% of the second-class passengers, and 75% of the third-class passengers. The class differences were even starker for women and children, who were given priority access to the lifeboats. Just 7% of first class, but over half of third class passengers went down with the Titanic. The divergent fates of the Titanic's passengers present a dramatic illustration of the connection between social class and what pioneer sociologist Max Weber called life chances. Weber invented the term to emphasize the extent to which our chances for the good things in life are shaped by class position. Contemporary sociology has followed Weber's lead and found that the influence of social class on our lives is indeed pervasive. Table 1.1 gives a few examples. These statistics compare people at the bottom, middle, and top of the class structure. They show, among other things, that people in the bottom 25% are less likely to be in good health, more likely to find life boring, less likely to have internet access, and more likely to be the victims of violent crime. Those in the top 25% are healthier, safer, more likely to send their kids to college, and more optimistic about the future. It is no wonder that they are on average happier with their lives. Thoughtful observers have recognized the importance of social class since the beginnings of Western philosophy. They knew that some individuals and families had more money, more influence, or more prestige than their neighbors. The philosophers also realized that the differences were more than personal or even familial, for the pattern of inequalities tended to congeal into strata of families who shared similar positions. These social strata, or classes, divided society into a hierarchy. Each stratum had interests or goals in common with equals, but different from and often conflicting with those of groups above or below them. Finally, it was noted that political action often flows from class interests. As one of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, observed, the rich seek social stability to preserve their advantages, but the poor work for social change that would bring them a larger share of the world's riches. This excerpt is from Gilbert's introduction to his book on class in the US, and it serves our purpose well. It introduces both the topic for this unit and the text that is part of your required reading for class and division. For practical purposes, we cannot delve into all aspects of class in the US that Gilbert's book covers, such as class differences in income, prestige, power, and other key variables, and how these variables react to one another. We will instead focus on just a few select elements, namely social mobility and poverty. However, it is useful to keep in mind these broader frameworks as we explore these topics, thinking about, for example, how a person's income affects beliefs about social policy, or how one's job affects the choice of friends or spouse. Our first main element is social mobility, which is about movement from one class to another based on the concept that, quote, a society can have classes and still permit individuals to rise or fall among them, unquote. Our other main element is poverty, but first we have a few more general observations to introduce. Gilbert argues that the transformation of the American economy that has taken place in the last 20 to 30 years has had a profound effect on U.S. class structures. He claims that, quote, in recent years, increasing class inequality has become a national political issue. Critics argue that the United States is becoming a less egalitarian, more rigidly stratified society. They say that poverty is increasing, the middle class is shrinking, social mobility is declining, and wealth is becoming more concentrated, unquote. Another critic on the subject of class in the US is Bill Keller, executive editor of the New York Times, and he says the following in the preface to the newspaper's book Class Matters. Quote, in a country where the overwhelming majority of people identify themselves in polls as middle class, there seemed to be no consensus as to what class meant, let alone whether it mattered, unquote. One of the New York Times reporters contributing to this book, Janie Scott, stated that it was beginning to become clear to most economists that mobility in the United States was neither what they had long believed nor what most Americans took for granted. Also, class had become more, not less, of a predictor of who was getting into elite four-year colleges. Class differences in health and lifespan appeared not to be shrinking but widening. Class seemed to be playing an increasingly rather than decreasingly powerful role in where Americans were choosing to live. Analysis of data from the last 3 censuses showed that the affluent had become more and more isolated from everyone else. It appeared that Americans had become less likely to marry across class lines than they once were, and class differences in family structure and child rearing were on the rise. Furthermore, Keller argues that at the same time other factors were making America appear less class-bound than ever. The general rise in affluence had obscured the traditional class markers and distorted the old class-based political alignments. It was no longer so easy to guess a person's place in the social hierarchy by his race or religion or possessions. According to Janie Scott, it was the contradiction that fascinated the New York Times. At a time when, by many measures, class seemed less and less a force in American life, it had become more so in some of the areas that matter most. This all tells us that there is a need to investigate notions of class beyond the traditional view that the US is an egalitarian society, emphasizing social mobility for all through the American dream regardless of where you come from, both in ethnic and national terms and socioeconomically. Hollywood has famously given life to this notion of the American dream, creating a somewhat simplistic view, both at home and abroad, concerning the role of socioeconomic barriers and status, or class, if you will. Take Disney's When You Wish Upon a Star, for instance. When you wish upon a star makes no difference who you are. Anything your heart desires will come to you. If your heart is in your dream, no request is too extreme. When you wish upon a star, as dreamers do. Fate is kind, she brings to those who love the sweet fulfillment of their secret longing. Like a bolt out of the blue, fate steps in and sees you through. When you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. You can listen to the audio version of Cliff Edwards singing the song by following the link under Cultural Studies materials on our course website. How would you interpret these lyrics? Can you find traces of the American dream of egalitarianism in this text? By following the pilgrim values that are central to American identity and society, namely having faith and a strong work ethic, This Hollywood production, and many others of its kind, promotes the belief in anyone being able to achieve success, regardless of their background. Since Hollywood ensured a way for U.S. culture to reach into the world's living rooms, many foreign students therefore believe that American society is classless and fully equal, and that is a notion this unit aims to challenge. As you review the first pages of the Gilbert excerpt, pages 13 to 15 and 16 to 17, you want to think about the following questions that he explores in his book. Is the gap between the rich and the rest of the population growing? Are opportunities to get ahead better or worse than they were in the past? Are neighborhoods becoming more segregated by social class? Is the balance of political power between classes changing? Please read Gilbert pages 130 through 138 and try to answer the following questions. How much mobility is there in the U.S.? Are the opportunities for mobility increasing or decreasing? Why? What factors determine mobility rates? What are the underlying causes of intergenerational mobility according to Gilbert? Gilbert concludes that, quote, in the race to the top, it helps to start there, unquote. What do you think about this statement? Gilbert argues that the trends he has explored on social mobility, quote, could have powerful political implications, unquote. What implications is he referring to, and why is this important? And what is your conclusion on social mobility in the U.S.? Ogden Nash wrote in The Terrible People, quote, some people's money is merited and other people's is inherited, unquote. John F. Kennedy is quoted having said, a rising tide lifts all boats, unquote. What is your immediate response to these two quotes? Do they indicate a particular view on class and social policy? What can we learn about American values from these quotes? Do they contradict each other? Please read Gilbert pages 216 to 238 and try to answer the following questions. How is poverty defined and measured, and how many Americans are poor? What are your thoughts on Orshansky's poverty line? Why does Gilbert deem it problematic and or controversial? Who are the poor? What can you learn about the ethnic group 6022 focuses on in terms of poverty? What are the long-term trends in poverty, and what are the causes of poverty? Please explain what is meant by the development of a permanent underclass. Why has American society failed in reducing its poverty rates after the early 1970s? Briefly explain the reasons for what Gilbert refers to as the mystery of persistent poverty. Comment on Gilbert's statement that, quote, the homeless population was the ominous tip of the poverty iceberg, unquote. How has government policy responded to poverty? Briefly outline how the national will to fight poverty has waxed and waned in recent American history. Why do you think reform has been difficult? Why do you think it is the case that, quote, any serious discussion of poverty in an affluent society which also regards itself as democratic inevitably stirs political emotions, unquote? Lyndon B. Johnson said the following in 1964. We stand at the edge of the greatest era in the life of any nation. Even the greatest of all past civilizations existed on the exploitation of the misery of the many. This nation, this people, this generation has man's first chance to create a great society, a society of success without squalor, beauty without barrenness, works of genius without the wretchedness of poverty. What do you think about this quote? What did LBJ's social policies achieve in the U.S.? Were his ideas successful? And have they been enduring in American society? Based on your reading on social mobility and poverty in the U.S., Do you think the concepts of an American dream and an egalitarian society are appropriate labels for American society today? How does class help shed light on other American cultural and literary elements in ENG 6022, such as integration and position of minorities? Please read Gary Love's lecture on class in British society and think about the following discussion question. How does class help shed light on other British cultural and literary elements in ENG 6022?